Hey friends, so this is definitely not the video that I thought I was going to be uploading today, but it is something that I wanted to talk about because the work that Stan Lee did was really important to me, and maybe not necessarily in the way that you might think. And don't worry, I'll have you back to your regularly scheduled flow game in another week, but I wanted to take a moment to commemorate the memory of a man who had an enormous impact on me, not just as a comic book fan, but also as an artist. You see, my story as an artist doesn't actually start with poi or dance or any of that. It actually starts with comic books. When I was 12 years old, my brother returned home from school with a copy of X-Men number 11, which he'd bought off of a classmate of his. Now, I was already familiar with comics because, of course, nearly everybody is, but in my mind, they were very crude and immature and really for kids that were a lot younger than me. And then after reading X-Men number 11, I really abruptly changed my mind. Now, I didn't understand the story one bit. It was the second part of a two-part story. But what really grabbed me was the incredibly dynamic, crisp, and detailed artwork of Jim Lee. And quite frankly, literally after just reading that one comic, it inspired me to learn how to draw myself. Now, growing up, both of my parents were scientists, and so I had a lot of science in the house growing up. I was learning basics of paleontology, biology, astronomy, etc., but art was not a very big part of my upbringing. But seeing Jim Lee's artwork and making the goal to try and be able to draw comics like he did was a really watershed moment for me. Not just because it brought art into my life, but also because it taught me the basic value of craft. You see, learning craft is one of the most fundamental parts of learning how to create art. And ironically enough, it's something that very few other occupations really have in common with it. You know, anything that involves using your hands or creating something involves learning the process by which those things are created. And even though I had learned a whole bunch of facts and figures about the world around me and its history, I had never actually applied myself to learning how to create something. And so for years, I studied the basic proportions of the human body and the rules of perspective and composition, and eventually I had a very, very brief and unremarkable career as a comic book artist. But that planted the seed in me to learn how to apply myself to learning other arts. And years later, I used the exact same techniques to teach myself how to play multiple instruments, how to spin poi, to dance, and even to run my YouTube channel, to make and produce videos, edit them, and be able to promote them on social media and gain an audience. And all of that comes back to that one comic book, X-Men number 11, that I read as a kid. It is not a stretch to say that without that one comic, I would not be where I am today. Okay, so what exactly does that have to do with Stan Lee? Well, even though Stan didn't directly have an influence on that journey, he had a massive indirect influence on it. You see, when Stan Lee came to what was then called Timely Comics, they were primarily focused on things like science fiction, fantasy, and romance comics. Those of us who are super into comic book history, of course, will remember that Spider-Man debuted in the pages of Amazing Fantasy, that Thor first appeared in Journey into Mystery, and that Iron Man first appeared in Tales of Suspense. This is because all of these titles were anthology science fiction or horror titles. Timely wasn't publishing superheroes at the time. This was something that Stan Lee pushed them into. And in so doing, he completely changed the face of multiple industries. Because Marvel Comics, within the decade, became a major player and a major rival to DC. And that rivalry caused DC to change a lot of their game plan too. And of course, coming into the 90s, the characters that Stan Lee helped create became some of the most powerful properties at the box office and on television. And it all came from one very simple idea that Stan Lee had back in the 1960s, that superheroes could be human beings too. Stan Lee created heroes that were also human, and because of that, we could see ourselves reflected in them. It's one thing to have a superhero that is this idealized version of what you could be, and it's quite another to see a hero that reflects your everyday experiences and helps guide you to the path of saying, hey, I can make the choice to do the right thing just like Peter Parker or Tony Stark or any of them have. I truly believe that comic books are our modern-day mythology. Rather than Hercules and Achilles, we have the stories of Superman, Batman, and Captain America. These are the stories that kids grow up reading and that influence their values and how they approach the world. They're their origin stories in terms of how a child can work their way into adulthood and make the choices necessary to have a good life. And that's why to this day, I still think of comic books as one of the most important mediums that I go to escape. It may have been the artwork that was the initial hook that brought me into the comic book world, but it was absolutely the stories that kept me there. And we have Stan Lee to thank for a lot of the conventions that led to those stories. And now that comic books are a huge cornerstone of the stories that kids read growing up, but also a huge cornerstone of the film and TV industries, we can see that this one small idea that Stan Lee had has had a major impact on the world around us. So you see, even though he didn't write or draw the first comic book that I ever read, he did create the X-Men. And without that comic, I would not be where I am today as an artist. So I clearly owe Stan Lee a very huge debt. And comics in general today too. They remain a huge influence on me and how I approach art. If you've seen any of my graphic design work, you'll see that influence at play, with its hard contrasts and dynamic lines. Heck, the masthead that I use on YouTube and all of my social media, with the moving bodies against a kind of disappearing background, is ripped off straight from Will Eisner's playbook. And bear in mind, I'm not saying that Stan Lee was any kind of angel. He clearly walked over a lot of artists to get to the place that he eventually enjoyed as a mascot, not just for Marvel, but in the comic book industry in general. Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko clearly had as much to do with the success of Marvel Comics in the 1960s as Stan Lee did, and yet as far as mainstream culture is concerned, both of them died in relative obscurity. But I also have a hard time blaming Stan for trying to make comic books more a part of everyday life in America. Quite frankly, because I benefited from it and so many other people that I know did too. So in the end, all I can say is, Stan, thank you for the amazing gifts that you've given myself and so many other people. Thank you for the stories. Thank you for the myths. Thank you for the inspiration. Thank you for starting so many artists, myself included, on their journeys. You will be missed, Stan. Rest in peace. Excelsior. In addition to Stan Lee, I also want to thank my awesome supporters on Patreon for helping to make this video and the others on my channel possible. If you want to support the work that I do, please head on over to patreon.com/DrexFactorPoi. Thanks in advance.